Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for the Research Ethics and Policy series. I'm Holly Fernandez-Lynch, and I co-chair this series along with Steve Jaffe, Department Chair of Medical Ethics and Health Policy. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Bob Cook-Deegan for his lecture titled Hoping for a Phoenix, Building a Better NIH on the Rubble. From your lips too. I'll say a few more words of introduction in just a second, but we, as usual, have several announcements. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. on the 8th floor, Bob is going to give us another lecture, this one called Kinks in the Triple Helix. And that will discuss the historical model of U.S. innovation driven by partnership between government, industry, and academia, and kinks in that approach that have not been fully disentangled, including who owns what and how the public should benefit from research investments made with their tax dollars. Our next REPS lecture is on May 12th with Penn's Katie Courtwright, who is going to be discussing ethics in palliative care trials. And then it's not on the slide here, but I just wanted to make a pitch for another lecture that I think will be of interest to this audience, a virtual only lecture on May 5th, as I mentioned, with Caroline Pothet, who is head of advanced therapies at the European Medicines Agency. And she's going to be discussing EMA's approach to supporting rare disease drug development. You can find information about all of those on our department's website. And as always, let us know if there are people that you'd like us to invite to come give lectures as part of this series. As a quick reminder, we have some online resources through our department, including a series of short research ethics online courses that are available for free continuing education credit. And some of these can also be used to satisfy your human subjects training requirements at Penn and CHOP. And then thanks as always to our reps co-sponsors and especially to Lisa Bailey. Okay, so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Bob Cook-Deegan is a professor at Arizona State University in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. Before starting his faculty career at Duke, where he was founding director of the Center for Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy, Dr. Cook-Deegan spent over a decade at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and before that worked for the National Center for Human Genome Research and the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. Based on that experience, he authored The Gene Wars, Science, Politics, and the Human Genome, a comprehensive account of the struggle to launch the Human Genome Project. He's a prolific author, expert in many things, including health and science policy, biomedical research, genomics, genetic policy, open science, cancer, and intellectual property. So thanks for joining us today. As usual, we can take questions from those of you in the room and those of you online, and we are recording today's lecture. Thank you.
So thanks, Holly, for that warm introduction. And yes, you're looking at your own city here with the Delaware River wandering through. This is the view from the space station as of last December. Thanks so much for inviting me to come here because it gave me an excuse to pull together a talk that I've been thinking about for well over 2 decades. And for most of those 2 decades, the idea was to take an organization that is a world standard, the National Institutes of Health, and the largest supporter of biomedical research on the planet, and one of the largest research institutions of any kind that has ever been created by humankind, and kind of thinking about how to tweak it and make it a little bit more functional. But then, of course, Trump 2 started, and that's where the rubble comes from in the title here. And we decided to do 2 projects at Arizona State University through the consortium on science, policy, and outcomes. One was to look at post-war science in general, not just biomedical research, and think about how to improve the system, assuming that maybe we have a moment of opportunity now politically, that once the storm has passed, there will be a rebuilding effort, and that rebuilding effort might incorporate some reform. So that was going across the board for all science and technology. And within that, of course, the National Institutes of Health that we've been thinking about. As I say, I've been dealing with NIH since I came to Washington in 1982. So with that, let me proceed, and I'm gonna, here's a map of where we're gonna go. I'm gonna spend a moment saying what's creating the rubble. And then I'm gonna take you through a history, of a very short history of how the NIH emerged at the end of World War II and how it has transformed. Look at some of the tensions that have emerged. There's a little kind of almost flippant section of the talk, and then I'm going to talk about where we think some ideas for reform might be coming from and what we might be able to do to make the system work better. So here's where we are. As you probably know, last year there was a proposal coming from the president to cut NIH's budget by 40%, and this year it's down to a cut of only 15%. And that got rescued by the House and the Senate appropriations, mainly the labor HHS subcommittees, but there was also a rescue job on the National Science Foundation. Other parts of the science and technology infrastructure have not fared quite as well, but NSF and NIH emerged from the end of a really arduous process. But you will remember a year ago at this time, my life, basically every day, every week, I was getting phone calls from trainees, former students who had lost their grants, lost their jobs, looking for new places to work. And it was truly catastrophic. It's certainly the worst period in my career of mentorship, of trying to tell people to what they were going to do with their lives that they had devoted to doing biomedical research or ethical, legal, and social implications research in an environment where everybody was on the street looking for jobs simultaneously. But in the end, the appropriation subcommittees, and this is Rosa DeLauro, the main Democrat in the House appropriation subcommittee for the NIH, in her glorious purple hair, a real champion of NIH, but actually NIH and NSF both were mainly rescued by the Republican factions within particularly the US Senate. So we got through 2025 with pretty much an intact budget, and by miraculous Herculean effort, the staff at NIH got the money shoveled out the door. But on the bottom right corner, you'll see, facing the new reality of NIH funding, one of the ways that NIH shoveled the money out the door was to shift grants to multi-year funding, which means when you get your grant up front, you get all the years of your grant incorporated in it, which what it means is that's a shift for NIH. And at the end of 4 years of doing that, NIH would hit a new steady state. But during those 4 years, it means that it would be really difficult to get new grants because the amount of money available for new grants would be severely constrained by the huge dollops of money going to the new grants from 2025. So we're going to have to go through this. I don't know if they're going to stick with the multi-year funding. The appropriators have said, not so fast. They've capped the number of things that can be shifted to multi-year funding, but NIH is going through a crisis. And in fact, it's not necessarily a bad idea to do that, because there's a possibility, I'll get into this a little bit later, there's actually a possibility that we could reduce the level of paperwork and bureaucracy by doing multi-year funding. And it's kind of too bad that NIH didn't take advantage of the doubling period from 1998 to 2003 to incorporate multi-year funding, because now we wouldn't be so vulnerable to the vicissitudes of a change of political leadership if we had multi-year funding in process already. So here's where we are now. As of April 3rd, when the president's budget request came out, NSF its budget is cut by more than half, and NIH is going to be down by 15%, according to the president. as you probably know, but in case you didn't know, the move against indirect cost reimbursement, the cap of 15% that was proposed last February, basically the administration's ability to appeal that to the Supreme Court, the courts have basically said, can't you read the law? The appropriator said you can't do that. So it's made it through the district court and appeals court level, and the deadline for appealing it to the Supreme Court passed on about a week and a half ago. So that's over. Basically, the administration lost. Administrative costs, the indirect costs will not be capped at 15%. Doesn't mean the negotiation is over on that front, but it does mean that things are more or less on the deal. And I actually think that at the end of this fiscal year, which almost certainly won't be September 30th, because that's no longer the norm. I suspect that we'll have a budget that will carry into a lame duck Congress, and depending on what happens on November 3rd, or is it November 5th? After the elections, when the new Congress comes in, the tradition is for the new party to want to have control of the budget when they walk in the door. So I suspect we won't have a stable budget again until sometime well into 2027 with the new Congress. So this is where we are now. And what happened last year was a lot of cuts of grants. I know that happened here, a lot of uncertainty. At the NIH level, a lot of staff were let go. In the area that I work with in genomics, they wiped out the communication staff, the policy staff, the history staff, and of the National Human Genome Research Institute. And Eric Green was the first institute director let go with the new administration. So there's been a lot of chaos at NIH, and people there, please be nice to your project officers because they've been living through hell. But that's where we are. So, and now I'm going to do a kind of a history, and I'm going to race through a history of NIH and how it emerged after World War II. But actually, this is a picture of before World War II. And in the top right corner there, you'll see the treetops, the home of the Wilson family, which is the farm. They gave up about 2/3 of their farm to this to the government, and the government was looking around for who should occupy this space. And it turned out that exactly that time they were thinking of moving the National Institutes of Health from its facilities in New York and other parts, and they wanted to have a Washington base for it. And the Surgeon General got wind, was notified that this farm was available, and that became the basis for what you see in the bottom left corner there, which is the NIH campus that we know today. They also acquired some land from a convent and from the farm that was next door. But this is now the largest institution that does biomedical research that the planet has ever known. This is the intramural research. This is the main base for the intramural research program. And in the top left, what you see is Surgeon General in his white garb. The widow of Wilson, her husband had died of cancer just a few months before this picture was taken, and they're laying the foundation in what is now Building 1, the Shannon building on the NIH campus. It's the main administrative building, and it's where my first office when I worked at NIH was located. So I'm going to go through very quickly the stages of what happened with NIH. NIH, as we know it now, went into World War II with a budget of $700,000. It was a tiny, tiny, tiny creature. And most of that money was spent on intramural research on diseases that affected sailors and the concerns of infectious disease in the public health service. Most of the funding for medical research during World War II, which gave rise to things, I'll be talking about this a little bit more tomorrow, but it gave rise to the miraculous discovery and development, the development of penicillin. Corticosteroids got a lot of attention. Anti-malarials were developed during World War II. most of the money for that was done not through the National Institutes of Health, but rather through the Office of Scientific Research and Development that was headed by Vannevar Bush. And it was done under contracts, some of it to institutions, a lot of it going to companies. And OSRD had all these contracts to support research, to support the war effort. And penicillin, if you read the very famous report that Vannevar Bush did at the end of his term, thinking he was going to be writing a report for FDR, but by the time the report came out in July of 1945, FDR had died in April of 1945. So it's a report that went to a Truman administration that had very little interest in the report. And it actually, there's a long history. I'll get a little bit more into that tomorrow when I talk about it. But the main thing is there was money that was going into medical research. Penicillin is the first line in Vannevar Bush's report on miraculous things that we did during the war, because more soldiers die of infectious diseases and nasty things happening to their bodies than die of bullets and bombs. So penicillin was a truly miraculous. Going into World War II, you couldn't buy it. It was literally priceless. By the end of the war, it was so cheap, there was money left over in the coffers of contracts to buy penicillin from the companies that were producing it. And that gave rise to the extramural grants program. There was a 4 or 5 year battle between what was then called the Bureau of the Budget that wanted to severely constrain what was going on in the post-war period for research and development. And the idea of a national research foundation that Vannevar Bush sketched in his report, Science, the Endless Frontier. Basically, I'll show a diagram of that, but his idea was there was going to be one unitary science agency for the whole federal government. It would do military research, it would do health research, and it would do general science. That did not happen. And what happened was an internal battle within the bureaucracy that kept health research within the Public Health Service in what became the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and is now Health and Human Services. And the money that was left over from the OSRD, from the wartime funding of medical research, was converted from contracts to this new idea of grants. And that was the origin of the extramural research program. And that was cooking along, and biomedical research was growing rapidly. But what happened then in the 1950s and 1960s, once it was launched by the bureaucracy, the public health, that's stage one of this rocket, Mary Lasker and Florence Mahoney came up with a political strategy of, you know what, most research going into World War II that was for biomedical research was supported by the Carnegie Corporation and the Rockefeller Foundation and individual hospitals. And what Mary Lasker and her husband Albert, who also died of cancer, discovered was a political strategy for using external advocacy to extract dollars from the US Congress to support medical research as a much more sustainable way to support biomedical research. So they invented this strategy of advocacy for Congress to fund not themselves, but rather to fund research at academic institutions for the most part and research institutions. And so they created a political strategy that was then replicated in stage 3 of this rocket, is one group after another creating its own institute, which then becomes part of the baseline for the NIH budget. And then the next group comes along and creates its institute. And each new institute usually gets a little bit of extra money built into the baseline of NIH. And what you have is a spectacular rise in the amount of funding for biomedical research that carries through until the late 1960s when the coalition begins to fall apart. And if you're interested in it, there's a biography of Mary Lasker, and it's not a great history, but it's a very interesting story, and of Florence Mahoney. And they were in cahoots with Claude Pepper, who was then a senator and started this whole political strategy. And if you want to understand the politics of biomedical research, one of the best books you can read is Dick Reddick's Cancer Crusade, which is all about the National Cancer Act of 1971. And Mary Lasker really, really, really wanted applied research and practical clinical research. And James Shannon really wanted basic research, and they went to war over the National Cancer Institute. And that's what the story of the Cancer Crusade is all about. And it's basically, just to summarize what happened, is the compromise that came out of Congress is better than the idea that either of those two protagonists had. What we had was a National Cancer Institute that does do a fair amount of clinical and applied research, and even some health services research that I'll come back to. But under a governance structure that didn't extract NCI. What Mary Lasker wanted to do is lift NCI out of the National Institutes of Health and have it as an independent agency that was much more under control of the cancer constituencies that she had created. So that didn't happen, and it's a good thing that it didn't. So basically what Mary Lasker and Florence Mahoney discovered was that instead of this standard iron triangle of an executive branch agency, the congressional committees that give money to that agency and write the rules for that agency, and then an external interest group that takes the money that Congress appropriates and spends it on doing things. Here I'm using the example of the Forest Service and the timber industry. What they discovered was a golden quadrangle where, in fact, they were advocating as external advocates not to give the money to them as an interest group, but rather to give it to research institutes that could create a common pool of knowledge that would improve our lives over time by understanding disease so we could fix it. So, and the vertices of that quadrangle are basically still the appropriation subcommittees because they control the money. The NIH institutes are the places that the money gets channeled through. And then the academic health centers and research institutes are the places that actually do the work. And then you have this ecosystem of advocates that are advocating for cancer research. And that then became the AIDS movement, Alzheimer's movement, et cetera, et cetera. One of the secondary consequences of that political strategy is each constituency that created its own institute then created a unit on the org chart that is part of the budget and independently budgeted by the Appropriations Committee. So that when you look at the appropriation bills, they go institute by institute. There is an NIH overall budget, but it's broken down into the 27 institutes and centers, plus the director's office, and now ARPA-H. But what was beginning to happen is the proliferation of institutes. And what you see here on the left is what NIH looked like after James Shannon was stepping down and Marston was coming in as the director of NIH. And there was a reform movement to restructure NIH in that period, 1967 to 1968. That's also when Lister Hill, who was the champion in the Senate, and John Fogerty both disappeared off the political environment, one by retirement and the other by dying. And then James Shannon stepped down as the director of NIH. So the coalition all completely collapsed. The only thing left standing was Florence Mahoney and Mary Lasker. And it took them several years to get the budget going again. What we have now is what you see on the left there is the institutes. There are 10 of them in the 1960s. By 2025, we've gotten up to 27 institutes and centers that are independently budgeted. And every institute director all the way back to James Shannon has been complaining about this structure because it's unmanageable. You got too many people answering to one central authority. And the NIH director, just to give an example, Harold Varmus was the director of NIH. When he came back to NIH for a second gig, he went to the National Cancer Institute and he was the director of NCI. And one of the reasons was, as the director of NCI, he could actually do something about directing research and having control of research. Whereas as the NIH director, you're basically exhorting the institute directors to do things for you. So it's a much more direct, most of the authority at NIH has been, at least up until now, housed in the institutes and the center directors and the offices that support them. And you see that, I mean, it's just imagine trying to keep track of all of the stuff that's going on in that kind of an org chart. So these are the numbers that reflect the Lasker era that started really after World War II, really picked up in the 1950s. And you see the spectacular growth of these are inflation adjusted dollars going to NIH. And then you see the tailing off at the end of the 1960s as the coalition fell apart. And then taking a longer run at it, you see that it didn't ever stop. The NIH budget continued to grow all the way through 2003, 2004, and this caught the tail end of the doubling from 1998 to 2003. But this is what was happening if you break down the R&D budget, research and development, and take out the D part. This is what was happening under the surface. These are the big accounts for research and science in the federal government. And what you see is the huge wedge in the back there is the National Institutes of Health, and then the three institutes that were part temporarily of another part of the government that were folded back into NIH in the 1990s. What you see is that at the beginning of the 1970s, biomedical research is not a huge fraction of what's spent on research by the federal government. By the end of this, more than half of all research money coming out of the federal government is going through the National Institutes of Health. So where does this leave us in thinking about what we're going to do? There have been many reports coming out over the years and ideas about how to fix this problem of too many institutes, difficult to coordinate the research, cracks in the system. And Harold Varmus talked about proliferation of National Institutes of Health. In 2006, Congress said this is a severe enough problem that actually we're going to cap the number of institutes that can be created at NIH. And if you create a new institute, you have to kill one. So that's been the rule since 2006. But it's still unmanageable. And a bunch of folks from the outside have been thinking about how do we manage NIH more efficiently. This is just to make the point that all the way back for 2 or 3 decades, people have been thinking about NIH needs to be reformed. And here's other evidence of that. Roughly once a decade, the National Institutes of Health have come through and been asked, what are we going to do about NIH? How could we make it work better? All the way back to 1984, and one report after another. And all of them raise 2 issues that are hardy perennials. One is there are too many institutes, it's unmanageable, that I've already talked about. The second commonality here is it's very difficult for NIH to manage the 2 goals that have always been held in tension in biomedical research. One is the need for health, taking health seriously and improving the outcomes, health outcomes in the US system on the one hand, and scientific opportunity on the other hand. And NIH has gotten really, really good through the study section and peer review system at identifying scientific opportunity and channeling funds for scientific opportunity. But it's been less sensitive, according to Congress, in figuring out how to link what's coming out of science into actually affecting people's lives. And some evidence for that is the CTSA program, the translational science emphasis, and things like that that have emerged in the last 2 or 3 decades. But this goes all the way back to Mary Lasker. That's really what she was complaining about, is these eggheads in NIH spending all their money on molecular biology and cell biology. But, you know, what about the kids that are dying of cancer? So this tension has never really gone away. And it did reach not quite a boiling point, but you will see that there were these 2 reports that both came out in 2 months in 2024. One came from the current chair of the Labor Health the Senate committee that writes the rules for NIH. And the other coming from the equivalent committee in the House of Representatives, but with the direct cooperation of Adderholt, who's the chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House, both suggesting consolidation of NIH and restructuring of the NIH. These two reports don't overlap very much in what they're urging in the way of reform. One of them is mainly focused about transparency and biosecurity. The other one is about consolidation. But this just tells you there's kind of tension in the air. And this is what happens. This is what is lying in the background when those of us who've been trying to think about improving the structure of NIH come into the equation. And I also want to spend just a second here. Here I am at the University of Pennsylvania, which is the birthplace of the pseudo-uridine substitution that saved millions and millions of lives. And one of my heroes, Kathleen Carrico, was, of course, the origin of that. And my point here is that NIH is not the only problem in biomedical research. We've got all the institutional incentives, the soft money incentives, the bureaucracies that exist in the biomedical research system. And one of the lessons that I think we can learn from the COVID crisis that we faced in 2020 through 2022 was that our system for evaluating good science even has its flaws at the institutional level. So Kathleen Carrico has been really generous, and this university's made, I think, more than $1 billion off of the patents that she generated and that the university wouldn't license to her or Drew Weissman. And the reason was that she couldn't get a grant, and she couldn't get a grant because what she was working on was mRNA, and all of us, including me, knew that mRNA wasn't going to ever be practical. It's just too, it's too evanescent, it's too unstable, and it's never going to be practical. Well, of course, she didn't believe that, and she persisted. Drew Weissman and several other people here rescued her career, although not entirely. So she ends up at BioNTech, and Penn keeps the money, but she went elsewhere. And she's been playing nice, but it strikes two chords about the institutional framework. One is she probably wasn't terribly, she was writing a grant application a month, supposedly for like 3 years, and none of them succeeded. So there's a problem there. There's a problem at both ends, probably, but certainly there's a problem at the end of something that really did save millions and millions of lives, didn't get NIH funding. It didn't make it through the system. And if you look at the history of PCR, you look at the history of many miraculous technologies, we've got very similar stories of not being able to get money from NIH and sometimes not being able to get your publications through the one-word journals, Science, Cell, and Nature, that are the currency for promotion and tenure in our academic institutions. So we've got problems at the NIH level and at the institutional level. And also this new incentive for the market universities that Elizabeth Pop-Berman has written so much about and so well. Basically what happened, as you probably know, from the pseudo-uridine patents were basically licensed to not to a company, but to an organization whose job was to license it to other companies, which means now there are two people taking a cut. And these licensing agreements are basically what Niels Riemer, who managed the Cohen-Boyer patents, called a tax on innovation. And it is. It's a tax on innovation, probably a deserved tax on innovation. But nonetheless, what we've got now is two people taking a chink out of it. Penn to the licensee to all the sub-licensees. And it was a mess. And it mattered a lot less in the COVID crisis than it normally would, because there was such a push to get those technologies out the door. and so much money available in the parallel processing of the vaccine development. It's a miraculous story. I'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow. But so all I'm pointing out here is we've got some problems. We've got structural problems of NIH. We've got conservatism in what gets funded. And we've got this unsolved problem of balancing scientific opportunity and health outcomes. And we want research that does both of those things. So this is where I was going to take a pause and ask, I don't know how many of you are actually in the business of getting grants, but I was going to ask, do any of you use ERA Commons? And do any of you actually like it? Think it works well? You know, the last time I did a grant application, it was 6 pages of description of what I was actually going to do with it, 2 pages of the citations that we were using in that description of the research, and then 140 pages of other stuff. And the other stuff is IRBs, IUCACs, contracting procedures, blah, blah, blah. So these phone books are exemplary of a lot of people who are generating the paperwork that's needed to get the money. And so, and it's not that people at NIH are completely unaware of the problems of conservatism and the bureaucracy. They did decide to streamline the peer review process. I was on one of the first study sections that met under the new criteria last summer. And basically it was a very, very minor tweak that's mainly about not being able to comment on the team that's doing the research so that we can spread the money out instead of by reducing the incentive to praise the capabilities of people who already have a lot of grants under their belt, and gives them preference because they know what they're doing, and you're just going to be beating the folks who are the haves, and it makes it even harder for the haves not to break into the game. So there are a couple of, this is a kind of a section that's a little bit flippant, but I did want to point out that there is, and it's not unique to biomedical research at all, but there are 2 kinds of people, according to Perel, which is the people who are committed to a mission of an institution and the people who are committed to the institution to carry out that mission. And his thesis is that the group that's committed to the institution will always eventually have the power, write the rules, and make the decisions about people's careers and the flow of money. And then Putt's law of the successful bureaucrat is there are 2 classes of people, those who don't understand what they manage and those who manage what they don't understand. And I think we do see, I would say that over this period of a very stable 8-decade increase in the volume of biomedical research being funded by NIH, it's gotten ossified. And it's been time to kind of to crack some of those bones and see if we can create a little bit more flexibility. And here we find ourselves in 2025, 2026, doing the same debates that happened right after World War II, where the Bureau of the Budget is calling the shots. These days, it started as DOGE, but now it's the Office of Management and Budget that is putting out these presidential budget requests that lowball the NIH budget. And a biomedical research community that's actually doing the work in the advocacy community that want the work to keep going because everybody's against it. Everybody is against cancer and Alzheimer's disease and the diseases that we want to do something about. Another little humorous aside here is, I think sometime in the last 5 years, we've crossed the Szilard point. And the Szilard point comes out of a short story that Leo Szilard, he was a physicist. He actually had the first patent on nuclear fission. He was the author of the letter that Einstein sent to FDR to start the Manhattan Project. He wrote a kind of a satirical essay called The Mark Gable Foundation, of a guy who goes into frozen goes into, he puts himself in the deep freeze. He wants to put himself in the deep freeze for 300 years and then come back to a new world. But they defrost him 90 years later, which would be about 5 or 6 years from now. He's writing this in 1948. So around 2030, he gets defrosted and he discovers that everybody's lost their teeth because they've decided that teeth are unattractive and useless. And he comes across a big donor who makes his money by donating his sperm. That's his livelihood. And they share an agreement that in fact science is just moving too fast. So they want to know how to slow it down. And Mark Gable is the donor. And the guy who's coming out of the defrost basically says, well, I know how you can do that. Create a foundation. You will put all the scientists on the peer review committees, and they will spend all the time vetting the proposals for what gets funded, and they won't do any science themselves. That's a really, really good way to slow things down. Moreover, another point that he makes in the essay is at some point, and we've probably crossed this point, you're imposing so many costs on the people applying for the money that the amount of money that you give out to successful applicants is the same or less than it would be if you didn't go through the application process. And if you look at the success rates of NIH in the last 2 or 3 years, the last grant that I got had an 8% success rate at NCI, which means that there were 12 applications, phone books, that went into NIH for the one that got funded for 5 years. The external costs of creating those applications is pretty substantial, and the success rates have actually gone down since I can't remember when I got that grant. I think it was 2019. So this is actually a real phenomenon that could be happening. So what are we doing about it? There has been a lot of talk. These are some examples of writings that have been done about let's improve the system for biomedical research. These slides are going to be available, and I've tried to put links to all of them so that you can find these documents if you need to follow up on them, if you have a wish to follow up on them. But here I'm going to turn to what I think are some ideas for what we might do in the way of reform. One of the huge holes in the system, we've been really, really good at molecular biology and cell biology. We've been a whole lot less good at understanding the system of delivery of healthcare. And I think we're less good at this in the United States than they are in the other OECD countries. And yet the US federal government is the largest purchaser of health goods and services on the planet by a large margin, both because our health system is so expensive, but also because Medicare, Medicaid, Federal Employees Health Benefit Program, the VA health system, the Indian Health Service, these are all federal programs that are paying for healthcare goods and services. And yet we don't have a brain at the top doing systematic technology assessment of what should we pay for and how much should we pay for it. ICER is doing some of this work up in Boston, but they're supported basically by the Arnold Foundation and a coalition of payers and other supporters of their work. But that's no match for the incredibly gargantuan healthcare system in the United States, which is larger than the GDPs of any but 3 countries on the planet. Our overall health. And if you just take the federal part, we would place about number 8th or 9th in GDPs globally, just for the federal contributions to healthcare in the United States. One of the reasons that we don't have a brain is that it's really politically perilous to do work in that area, because the information that you're creating is basically the most valuable information you can create is this doesn't work and it's not worth paying for. The people that deliver that service are not going to be happy with that message. And we have, I've got this alphabet soup of the organizations that we've had in our federal government to try to do this technology assessment framework. the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality is yet again on the chopping block. Its staff is down to 10% of the size it was a year and a half ago. And that's the one part of the federal government that was actually trying to do some of this work about how does the healthcare system work. So here are the proposals that are floating out there. One is to consolidate some NIH institutes to reduce the complexity of that organizational chart so that it's more manageable. There's a move now in reaction to the proposal to cap indirect costs at 15%. There has been a move to make the process more transparent. I'm actually not a big fan of the FAIR proposals that have been put out. Kelvin Drogemeyer and the people that have worked on that have done yeoman's work. I know they're working really hard on it, but it's going to be a really elaborate, burdensome system that requires a lot of paperwork. And I will say that during World War II, Vannevar Bush had one policy on indirect costs, which was companies get 100% indirect cost return, and academic and research institutions got 50%. It was flat. Everybody played by the same rules, and it was really simple. And that meant you didn't have to do all this accounting. You didn't have to track expenditures and things like that. I would hope maybe we'll militate towards that. It can't be two-tier system, but it probably could be a three-tier system or something like that. I hope something like that will emerge. One of the hardy perennials that's in the background is that, in fact, it is still true. It's less true than it used to be, but it's still true that a lot of the have institutions like this place tend to do much better in the competition for funding, and it makes it really hard to break into the system. And that's been identified as a problem throughout the United States, especially in the places beyond the coasts. There have been proposal after proposal after proposal about how to improve the peer review system. And one of the ideas that's come up over and over again is, you know what, peer review really worked well for identifying the things that absolutely you don't have to think about it. They're really, really good proposals, just fund them. And the ones that, oh my gosh, this is never going to work, don't even bother to review it. But the really hard work on a study section is usually the middle third, where it's really hard to distinguish. And it's actually beyond the capability of folks to distinguish what's actually going to be productive from what isn't. And a bunch of economists have looked at that and said, well, okay, triage, fund it, don't fund it, and in the middle, throw the dice, have a lottery system. And this has been proposed over and over again for both NIH and NSF. It's never been experimented with, except in very discrete things that can't be generalized. So that's another possibility for refinement of the peer review system. The big flaw in the US system, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest thing that we really need to do is to improve our system for health services research. I'm not sure that should be at the National Institutes of Health, but I think it should exist somewhere in the federal government so that we're not relying on Arnold Ventures to support our whole health technology assessment. And another thing that has been experimented with and has worked quite well in the Department of Defense programs is to have advocates pulled onto both the council level and the study section level in peer review to infuse end users into the process of deciding what should be funded. And then probably the most important thing right now is to reverse what's happened in the last year, which is to add a layer of review on top of study section council. And now it goes to some black box of political vetting that says, oh, we're not going to fund that because it's not one of our priorities. That's really destructive in the long run. And I actually expect that will happen when the storm passes. So just to summarize what I hope I've covered in the talk is there are some promising developments. NIH is forming a group to think about how do we support research. Let's do some research on how the system works so that we understand what we're trying to reform. And I think that's a great thing. It would be really nice if the costs that are associated with all the regulatory frameworks that we've put in place, if we actually kept track of how much is being spent to meet this mandate versus that mandate so that we can actually figure out the cost benefit of doing those mandates. We don't have that information right now, and it's really frustrating for those of us working in the policy arena because there's no data. There's just opinion. I guess my strongest invocation is let's develop a system where Congress gives the permission to the funding agencies to experiment, evaluate, iterate, and create a learning system so that we can improve the system over time. And then the final observation is there's a tendency now, even in biomedical research, which has been immune from it for a while, to frame biotechnology and economic development in nationalistic terms. And for a long time, the US was really a leader in making sure that we were creating science for all humankind and creating it as a global public good. And I'm sensing some real tensions. I know that in the work that we're doing now, we have to report any foreign collaborator. And that creates paperwork, but it also creates a really strong incentive not to include foreign collaborators because it increases the paperwork. And it also increases the likelihood that you're going to get snagged in the system at NIH. So I would love a return to the idea of the US leading in. It's not completely, it doesn't have to be completely open science, but it does have to be unfettered communication about the results of science and how we set our priorities. So those are my ideas for building a better NIH. And the project that we started, we're doing one, as I said, for all of science policy. And our hypothesis is there may be a moment of opportunity when the storm passes and when this kind of mindless cutting of grants and staff and capping indirect costs, all the stuff that happened last year, when that's over and we can begin to rebuild on and take these ideas that have been in the air for decades and start implementing them in a new system that's a little bit more flexible and is more amenable to being a learning healthcare system and healthcare research system. So thank you.
Have a few minutes for questions.
Reed.
Great talk, Bob. Thanks very much. You have a sense that when the quote unquote storm passes, that there's latent support for these ideas on the Republican side of the aisle?
Yeah, there is. So the rescue job on the budget this year, I think, was the junior senator from Alabama, Tom Cole, and Susan Collins this year. And they are staunch supporters of biomedical research in general. But the thing is, there's a little wrinkle here. The appropriators in 15 years ago gave a mandate to NIH to address, they wanted an external committee to help NIH think about how to make NIH work better. And that group met 2 or 3 times and then just stopped meeting. That was a really strong signal from the appropriators that they would like to see some reform at NIH. And it was largely, basically, it was suppressed by NIH itself. And I think it was a political mistake to do that. And it came back to bite us this year. That's why the plan that came out of the House that I mentioned, it was going to collapse these 27 units into 8. And you would have had the National Institute for General Medical Sciences, the National Library of Medicine, and the Genome Institute all in one institute, which is completely nonsensical. Nobody who actually understands NIH would make that suggestion. So it needs to be a thoughtful process. There is definitely support for NIH doing its job. Huge support for that on both sides of the aisle, and I think we've got evidence for that. Whether the particulars of particular reform ideas would be out there, I'm sure there's support for experimenting with the peer review system, for example. And also the part that would be very partisan is the part that's perhaps hardest to solve, which is creating a brain at the top to do the technology assessment. that I think is going to break along partisan lines. And I'm not terribly optimistic about our solving that problem, even though I think it's the most important problem to solve. Have I bored everybody to tears? Yeah, Holly?
So what I don't see here and your ideas for how to fix things is whether and how it might be possible to insulate NIH from this kind of destruction in future administrations. Do you have thoughts on that?
I have an optimistic hypothesis, and I actually believe this. I think we just went through a catastrophic year. And I think both political parties are going to learn that was a really stupid way to go about reform, is get a bunch of tech bros from Silicon Valley to come in and know nothing about the system that they're decapitating. I think that won't be replicated. It doesn't mean partisan stuff. Fetal tissue research is still going to be really controversial. Health services research can be really difficult to support. But I do think that the crazy experiment that we went through in 2025 is probably going to have a lesson for policymakers. And I think we've already got the signal from the appropriation committees that they didn't like it. I mean, it's the Republicans who are saying this was stupid. So I think, and the Democrats were already there. So I think I'm quite optimistic that one of the lessons that's going to come out of the last 2 years is this was a really, really dumb way to go about reforming incredibly important institutions. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's a first stab at it.
Time for one more. Steve? Yeah.
Steve?
Let me follow up on that thought, because like what, in your view, what's the right balance between, on the one hand, like political direction, political involvement, maybe not in like the day-to-day, but in shaping the overall direction versus the actual work of carrying out the mission of the end? Like where's the balance? Where's the
So the way we've done that, the genius of the NIH has been that the really high level decisions about how much should we be spending on Alzheimer's, how much should we be spending on cancer, heart disease, blah, 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 has actually been done at the level of the US Congress, which I think is the right place to do that. Because that's an institution that is set up to do representative government. And when it's functioning well, which it hasn't for 2 decades, but when it's functioning well, it actually serves that purpose of matching social need to what you're trying to do in the research enterprise. And I think the other part was really, it's gotten too conservative, the peer review system. But the idea that there's a merit review that dictates at the project level what you're going to fund versus what you're not going to fund, I think that's also brilliant. I think we need to tweak the merit review process and experiment with ARPA-like mechanisms and things like that. But I think I think that's the right framework. What I would like to get rid of is the pure political analysis on top, which is this doesn't meet our priorities right now. And I think maybe that will be the lesson that emerges from this, is that wasn't such a good idea because it's not very sustainable. And I think that's where I'm quite optimistic that we will get bipartisan consensus on the fact that doesn't get around the problem that the dynamics of leaving it to Congress did create the 27 institutes and the management problem that we've got at NIH. And that's where I want to be really cautious about. I think we need to have a really thoughtful process for thinking about how to do that. And I showed you the 4 reports that the national academies have done. And in no case have any of those recommendations about restructuring been carried out. So there's my interpretation of that is that's a really serious political problem that those of us in the community need to be thinking about and helping. And I want that to be a multi-year process before we start destroying things and changing things. But I do think that there are certain consolidations that could happen at NIH. And the key problem there is the constituency problem, because each of those institutes has its own constituency, and you need them to get to agree with one another that it's okay to have one boss for biomedical engineering or aging and child health, whatever. I don't know what that should look like, but 27 is just too many. And it also makes it very difficult for any particular disease to find a home. So
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.